The stale, recycled air of the overnight bus hummed a monotonous lullaby, a sound I'd come to associate with the creeping dread of another long journey. Outside, the inky blackness pressed against the smudged windows, punctuated only by the fleeting, ghostly glow of distant farmhouses. I shifted in my seat, the cheap fabric scratching against my bare arms. This was the 3 a.m. leg of the trip, the hour when consciousness felt like a fragile thing, easily surrendered. My seatmate, a man whose name I hadn't bothered to ask, had been a silent presence for the last 3 hours. He was a man of indeterminate age, his face lost in the shadows cast by the dim overhead lights. But his stillness was almost unnerving. He'd settled into his seat with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, then promptly surrendered to sleep, his head tilted at an unnatural angle against the headrest. Now, as the bus rumbled through the deserted countryside, his breathing began to deepen, becoming a soft, rhythmic snore that vibrated through the thin partition separating our seats. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the blurry landscape outside, the occasional glint of moonlight on wet asphalt. But the sound, a gentle invasion of my personal space, was a constant, if minor, irritation. I was on my way to see my sister, Sarah. A visit I'd been putting off for months, a knot of guilt and apprehension tightening in my stomach with each passing week. Sarah was complicated. She was the golden child, the one who'd always effortlessly navigated life's choppy waters, while I, the more introverted, artistic one, had always felt like I was floundering. Our relationship was a delicate dance of unspoken resentments and fierce, buried affection. A sudden lurch of the bus jolted me from my thoughts. My seatmate, who had been leaning precariously, suddenly tipped further, his head slumping sideways. Instinctively, I reached out, my hand hovering for a moment, before settling gently on his arm. He didn't stir. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible shift, his head found a new resting place. My shoulder. At first, it was just a weight, a warm, solid presence against my skin. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My body tensed, a primal instinct screaming at me to pull away, to reassert my boundaries. But something held me back. Perhaps it was the sheer exhaustion of the late hour, or a flicker of unexpected empathy for this stranger's deep slumber. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the lingering echo of a time when such physical contact, unasked for but accepted, had been a common occurrence in my life. I tried to exhale slowly, to relax my shoulders. But it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave. His breathing, now directly against my ear, was a warm, damp puff of air. I could feel the subtle rise and fall of his chest, a silent testament to his complete surrender. The scent of him, a faint, clean smell like old paper and something vaguely herbal, was surprisingly not unpleasant. My mind, however, refused to cooperate with my body's reluctant acceptance. It began to race, conjuring up 1,000 scenarios. What if he snored louder? What if he drooled? What if he suddenly woke up, disoriented and embarrassed? The thoughts were a frantic flutter, a flock of nervous birds trapped in my skull. I risked a glance at him. His face was still obscured by shadow, but I could see the gentle curve of his cheek against my collarbone, the dark stubble on his jaw. He looked utterly vulnerable, a stark contrast to the restless energy I'd sensed from him earlier. It was a strange intimacy, this shared space in the dead of night, a silent, unwilling embrace. The bus continued its relentless journey, the world outside a blur of darkness and fleeting lights. My own eyelids felt heavy, the rhythmic rumble of the engine, a siren song of sleep. I fought it, determined to stay awake, to maintain some semblance of control over my immediate environment. But the weight of his head, the steady warmth, was a powerful sedative. My thoughts began to drift, becoming hazy and indistinct. The scratchy fabric of the seat, the hum of the engine, the gentle pressure against my shoulder, it all began to merge into a soft, monotonous symphony. Slowly, insidiously, sleep began to claim me. My own head drooped, my eyelids fluttering closed. I was vaguely aware of the continued pressure, the comforting warmth, but it no longer felt like an intrusion. It felt natural. A strange kind of peace settled over me, a temporary reprieve from the anxieties that usually clung to me like a second skin. The next few hours were a blur of fragmented dreams, of shifting landscapes and phantom voices. I dreamt of Sarah, of our childhood home, of the sun-drenched days we'd spent exploring the woods behind our house. In these dreams, there was no tension, no unspoken words, just the easy camaraderie of sisters. It was a bittersweet escape, a fleeting glimpse of a past I both cherished and mourned. Then, a jolt. A sudden jarring movement that ripped me from the depths of sleep. The bus had hit a pothole, a particularly aggressive one that sent a ripple of movement through the vehicle. My head snapped upright, and with it, the head of my seatmate. He stirred, a low groan escaping his lips. His eyes fluttered open, blinking slowly as they adjusted to the dim light. I watched him, my heart thudding in my chest, a mixture of apprehension and a strange, almost childish curiosity. He stretched, his arms extending in a languid arc that brushed against my own. Then he rubbed his eyes, his movement still groggy and uncoordinated. He looked around, a confused expression on his face, as if he'd just woken up in a place he didn't recognize. And then he looked at me. His eyes, a clear, startling blue, met mine. For a moment, there was a flicker of recognition, a slight narrowing of his brow. I braced myself, expecting a mumbled apology, an awkward laugh. Instead, he smiled, a gentle, sleepy smile that transformed his face. And then, in a voice that was soft and melodic, laced with the lingering remnants of sleep, he said, "Hey, Sarah, you're finally awake." The world tilted. The hum of the bus, the scent of old paper and herbs, the weight of his gaze, it all receded, replaced by a deafening silence in my own mind. Sarah. He'd called me Sarah. Not my name, not even a generic greeting, but my sister's name. A cold wave washed over me, chilling me to the bone despite the warmth of his head that had, mere moments ago, been pressed against my shoulder. My breath hitched. My palms began to sweat. This was not a dream. This was not a joke. This was real, and it was 1,000 times more unsettling than any of my earlier anxieties. My seatmate, the stranger who had slept on my shoulder, had just called me by my sister's name. And in that moment, the long, complicated history between Sarah and me, the unspoken words and the lingering resentments, suddenly felt as tangible as the scratchy fabric of the bus seat. The name, Sarah, hung in the air between us, heavy and distorted, like a word spoken underwater. It wasn't a question. Not really. It was an assertion, a declaration that he believed, with every fiber of his being, that I was Sarah. My breath hitched, a small, involuntary sound that seemed to crack the fragile stillness of the bus. My mind, still fuzzy from the residual effects of sleep and the monotonous drone of the engine, struggled to process the sheer, unadulterated wrongness of it. He blinked, his eyes, a startling blue, slowly focusing on my face. They weren't the eyes I expected. Sarah's eyes were a warm, comforting brown, like polished oak. These were a glacial blue, the color of a winter sky just before a storm. Yet, in their depths, there was a flicker of recognition, a misplaced certainty that was more unsettling than any outright confusion. He stretched a languid arc, his arm brushing mine as he did, and a faint, clean smell, like old paper and something vaguely herbal, wafted from him. It was a scent that felt both comforting and alien, further blurring the lines of reality. "Sarah?" he repeated, his voice a low rumble, a melodic baritone that was surprisingly pleasant, despite the circumstances. It was the voice of someone who had slept soundly, undisturbed. And that was the problem. I hadn't slept soundly. I had been acutely aware of his presence, the warm weight of his head, the gentle rise and fall of his chest against my side. Every twitch of his body, every soft sigh, had been a tiny tremor in my own carefully constructed equilibrium. My own voice felt like a stranger's, thin and reedy. "I'm not Sarah," I managed, the words barely a whisper. I tried to pull away, to create even a sliver of space between us, but his arm, still draped in a kind of sleepy languor, was a gentle anchor. My heart hammered against my ribs like a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it, the moment I'd been bracing for in a way, ever since I'd seen him settle into the seat beside me. Not this specific scenario, of course, but some kind of intrusion, some breach of my carefully guarded personal space. He frowned, his brow furrowing slightly. The blue of his eyes darkened, a subtle shift that made them seem even more intense. He tilted his head, his gaze sweeping over my face, my hair, my everything. It was a slow, deliberate assessment, and I felt a flush creep up my neck. He was looking at me as if he were trying to reconcile a memory with a present reality, a memory that was clearly, irrevocably, wrong. You look different," he murmured, his voice tinged with a hint of confusion, but no alarm. That was the truly baffling part. There was no panic, no realization of a mistake, just a mild, almost academic curiosity. "Did you change your hair?" My hair was a nondescript brown, usually pulled back in a messy bun or a ponytail, practical and unremarkable. Sarah's hair, on the other hand, was a cascade of fiery red, a vibrant statement that always seemed to draw attention. I'd always envied its boldness, its unapologetic presence. I'd always felt like a pale imitation, a faded photocopy. "No," I said, my voice a little stronger this time, fueled by a surge of indignant adrenaline. "My hair is brown, Sarah's is red." He blinked again, slowly. The frown deepened. He ran a hand through his own hair, which was a sandy brown, a little disheveled from sleep. Then, his gaze fell to my hands, resting in my lap. My nails were usually unpainted, or occasionally a muted shade of gray or navy. Sarah's were always a bright, cheerful color. Coral, turquoise, a daring fuchsia. "Oh," he said, the single syllable loaded with a dawning comprehension. This time, there was a definite shift in his demeanor. The languid sleepiness began to recede, replaced by a more alert, more grounded presence. He finally moved his arm, pulling it back with a quiet grace that belied his earlier inertia. The sudden absence of his warmth was almost as disorienting as his presence had been. He looked at me again, and this time, his eyes were different. The certainty was gone, replaced by a flicker of embarrassment, a touch of awkwardness. He cleared his throat, a small, polite sound. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice now clear and steady, devoid of the sleepy huskiness. I must have been dreaming, or just really out of it." He offered a small apologetic smile. It was a kind smile, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of something akin to regret that I couldn't, or wouldn't, be Sarah. But the feeling was quickly eclipsed by a renewed wave of anxiety. The encounter had been so bizarre, so deeply unsettling, that I just wanted it to be over. I wanted to disappear into the anonymity of the bus, to pull my coat tighter and pretend this hadn't happened. It's okay, I said. Though it wasn't. It felt like a lie, a flimsy shield against the jarring reality of the moment. The weight of his mistaken identity had settled on me, a strange burden. It wasn't just that he'd called me by my sister's name, it was the implication. What did it say about me that I could be so easily mistaken for her? What did it say about him that he would dream of Sarah? Or mistake someone else for her? He shifted in his seat, turning to face the window, as if to give me space, to escape the lingering awkwardness. The bus rumbled on, the monotonous hum a familiar, almost comforting sound after the brief, intense disruption. Outside, the inky blackness was beginning to yield to a faint, pearly gray at the horizon. The landscape, blurry and indistinct through the smudged glass, was a desolate stretch of fields and sparse trees, bathed in the ghostly glow of the pre-dawn light. I watched him, my gaze drawn to the sharp line of his jaw, the way his shoulders were set. He seemed to be studying the passing scenery with an intense, almost melancholic focus. The brief intimacy of his sleep, the accidental intimacy of his waking confusion, had evaporated, leaving behind a palpable distance. He was a stranger again, a stranger who had, for a few disorienting moments, seen me as someone else entirely. My thoughts, however, refused to settle. They swirled and churned, replaying the moment over and over. Sarah. The name echoed in the cavern of my mind. It was such a simple name, yet it carried so much weight. It was the name of the sister who was effortlessly charming, the one who always knew the right thing to say, the one who shone while I simply existed, the one who had always been the subject of my parents' proud pronouncements, the one whose successes were measured in glowing report cards and beaming smiles, while mine were often met with a quiet nod and a polite, "That's nice." I glanced at him again, his profile etched against the brightening sky. He was handsome, in a quiet, understated way. His features were regular, his build lean. He could have been anyone, really. A businessman returning from a trip, a student heading home, a traveler seeking a new beginning. But the Sarah had changed everything. It had painted him with the brush of my own complicated history, turning him from a passive passenger into an unwitting participant in the ongoing drama of my family. Was he a friend of Sarah's? Did he know her well enough to mistake me for her, even in a sleep-addled state? Or was it a more abstract kind of recognition, a subconscious association that had surfaced in his dreams? The possibilities were endless, and each one sent a fresh ripple of unease through me. I hugged my knees to my chest, trying to regain a sense of control. The scratchy fabric of the bus seat beneath me was a grounding sensation. The air, still stale and recycled, felt heavy with unspoken questions. The journey was far from over, and now it felt like it was carrying an extra passenger, a phantom of my sister, conjured by a stranger's sleepy mind. I closed my eyes, trying to recapture the feeling of being merely myself, adrift on the monotonous lullaby of the bus. But the image of his startling blue eyes and the echo of that single, misplaced name refused to fade. It lingered, a persistent hum beneath the surface of my consciousness, a reminder that sometimes the most unsettling journeys are not the ones we plan, but the ones that unexpectedly take us to the heart of our own unresolved stories. The sun was beginning to climb higher, casting long shadows across the passing fields. The world was waking up, but I felt like I was still caught in a dream where I was Sarah, and yet I was undeniably, irrevocably, me. The distance between who I was and who he thought I was felt vast and immeasurable. And for the first time, that distance felt like a chasm I might never be able to bridge. The bus gave a sudden violent lurch, throwing me forward against the seat in front of me. My seatmate, who had been nestled so deeply in his slumber, jolted awake with a soft groan. His head, which had been a warm, heavy weight against my shoulder, snapped back. For a disorienting moment, the world was a blur of smudged windows and dim overhead lights, the rumble of the engine a dull throb in my ears. Then, his eyes, a startlingly clear blue against his pale, sleep-creased face, focused on me. "Sarah," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep, a rough, gravelly sound that seemed to scrape against the quiet of the bus. The name hung in the air between us, a fragile thing, easily shattered. My breath caught in my throat. Sarah, my sister. The one with the fiery red hair that always seemed to capture the sun. The one who moved through life with an effortless grace I'd always envied. I, with my mousy brown hair, the shade of damp earth, was decidedly not Sarah. A knot of apprehension, already pre-existing from the journey and the impending visit to my sister, tightened in my stomach. This was not the comfortable anonymity I'd been hoping for on this long, dreary ride. This was something else, something that felt like a misplaced puzzle piece, a glitch in the mundane transit experience. He blinked, his gaze sharpening, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. He looked at me again. Really looked, his eyes scanning my face, then my shoulder where his head had rested, then back to my face. The air crackled with a sudden, awkward tension. "Oh, sorry," he said, his voice clearing slightly, though still laced with grogginess. He pulled his head back fully, creating a sudden, almost painful void where his warmth had been. A faint, clean scent, like old paper and something vaguely herbal, lingered on my shirt. "I thought you were someone else. Fell asleep and must have been dreaming." He offered a small, apologetic smile, a fleeting thing that didn't quite reach his eyes. His face was a study in exhaustion, shadows etched beneath his startling blue eyes, a slight stubble darkening his jaw. He looked younger now, stripped of the confident slumber, more vulnerable. Indeterminate age was still a tricky assessment, but perhaps late 20s, early 30s. He was a stranger, and yet he had just called me by my sister's name. My own voice felt rusty, unused. "It's okay," I managed, trying to keep my tone light, to brush off the discomfort, but the words felt hollow, even to me. It wasn't okay, it was strange, deeply strange. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement, and turned to stare out the window. The landscape outside was a smear of inky blackness, punctuated by the occasional ghostly glow of a distant farmhouse. The bus continued its relentless journey, a metal capsule carrying its weary occupants through the desolate night. I tried to retreat back into my own head, to the familiar anxieties about Sarah, about the house I was going to, the conversations I was dreading. But the incident had lodged itself in my mind, a persistent burr. Why Sarah? It wasn't just a random name. It was my sister's name. Did he know Sarah? Was he going to see her too? The possibilities, each more unsettling than the last, began to spin in my mind. He shifted in his seat, the worn fabric of his jacket rustling. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dog-eared paperback. The dim overhead lights cast a faint yellowish glow on the cover, but I couldn't make out the title. He opened it, his brow furrowed in concentration. But I suspected he wasn't really reading. He was probably just as unsettled as I was, trying to regain his bearings, to pretend the awkward moment hadn't happened. Silence descended again, heavier this time, thick with unspoken questions. The monotonous hum of the bus engine seemed to amplify the quiet, making every small sound, the creak of a seat, the rustle of clothing, the faint snore from somewhere further down the aisle, seem unnaturally loud. I stole a glance at him. He was still staring at the book, his lips moving almost imperceptibly, as if mouthing the words. His profile was sharp, etched against the darkness, a study in quiet contemplation. What would Sarah have done? She would have probably laughed it off, made a witty remark, charmed him into forgetting the whole thing. She was good at that, at navigating social interactions with an ease that always felt like a foreign language to me. I, on the other hand, felt a familiar flush of heat creeping up my neck, a potent mix of embarrassment and a strange sort of defensiveness. I imagined Sarah's reaction if I told her. She'd probably tease me mercilessly. Oh, poor you, mistaken for your amazing sister. How will you ever recover? There was always that undercurrent, the unspoken comparison, the subtle elevation of her to some unattainable pedestal, while I remained firmly on the ground, fumbling. The bus slowed, a low groan emanating from its mechanics. We were pulling into a small, nondescript town. A few figures disembarked, shadows melting into the pre-dawn gloom. The doors hissed shut, and the bus lurched back into motion, leaving the quiet street behind. He looked up from his book, his gaze sweeping over the passengers who had remained. His eyes met mine for a fleeting second, and I quickly looked away, my heart giving a little frantic flutter. It felt like I was being scrutinized, judged. Was he wondering about the brown-haired girl who had been so unnervingly quiet while he slept on her shoulder? I hugged my worn backpack closer, as if it could shield me from his gaze, from the lingering echo of his mistake. The scent of old paper and herbs seemed to cling to me, a phantom reminder of his proximity. I wanted to ask him, to demand an explanation, to understand the connection that had led him to utter Sarah's name. But the words wouldn't form. Fear of further awkwardness, of revealing my own discomfort, held me captive. He cleared his throat, a small, dry sound. "Long trip," he commented, his voice directed more at the air than at me, but I knew it was meant for my ears. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "Really long." He nodded again, a small, almost imperceptible movement. He didn't elaborate. Neither did I. We were two strangers, bound together by a shared space and a moment of mistaken identity, adrift in the liminal hours of the night. The landscape outside began to shift, very subtly. The inky blackness softened to a bruised purple, the first hesitant hints of dawn painting the horizon. The world was slowly waking up, but I felt like I was still trapped in a dream, a disorienting haze of sleep and confusion. I shifted in my seat, trying to find a more comfortable position, but my shoulder still felt strangely sensitive where his head had rested. It was a phantom warmth, an imprint left by his slumber. I could almost feel the pressure of his cheek, the slight rasp of his stubble against my skin. It was a sensation that was both unnerving and, in a way I couldn't quite articulate, intimate. He closed his book with a soft thud, his gaze now fixed on the emerging light. His expression was unreadable. Was he thinking about Sarah? About the woman he had mistaken me for? Or was he simply contemplating the day ahead, the destination that awaited him? I found myself staring at his hands, resting on the closed book. They were long-fingered, surprisingly elegant, the nails neatly trimmed. They looked like hands that might hold a pen, or a brush, or perhaps the reins of some untamed creature. They were definitely not the hands of someone I knew. The bus chugged on, the engine's drone a constant companion. The sky grew lighter, revealing a bleak, wind-swept countryside. Trees, skeletal and bare, clawed at the pale sky. The world was still shrouded in a damp, gray chill. He turned his head then, his blue eyes meeting mine directly. There was no apology in them this time, no lingering sleepiness. There was something else, something I couldn't quite decipher. A flicker of recognition? A hint of curiosity? Or was it just the direct gaze of a fellow traveler, acknowledging the shared journey? "Are you going far?" he asked, his voice now clearer, more resonant. It was a pleasant voice, I realized, a melodic baritone that was a stark contrast to its sleepy, gravelly beginning. My heart gave another unwelcome lurch. I had been so focused on the mistake, on the name, that I hadn't considered the simple fact of our shared journey. "To the end of the line," I said, my voice a little steadier this time. "And you?" He paused, a slight hesitation before he answered. "Me too," he said, his gaze holding mine for a fraction longer than necessary. "End of the line." The words hung between us, heavy with an unspoken significance. End of the line. Was it just a statement of fact, or was there more to it? I felt a prickle of unease, a sense of being drawn into something I didn't understand. The mystery of why he had called me Sarah was still there, a shadow lurking beneath the surface of our polite conversation. But now, a new layer of intrigue had been added. He offered another small smile, this one a little more genuine, a little less apologetic. "Looks like we're in for the long haul, then." I could only nod, my throat suddenly feeling tight. The bus continued its relentless journey, carrying us both towards whatever awaited us at the end of the line, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was far from over. The ghost of Sarah, conjured by a sleepy stranger, had just begun to haunt my journey. The rumble of the bus, which had faded into a monotonous lullaby, now felt like a drumbeat against my skull. He'd said, "Sarah?" His voice, a low murmur, had been laced with an apologetic confusion. And then, before I could even process the disorientation of his awakening, he'd corrected himself, his eyes, a startling blue that seemed to hold the dim light of the bus, widening slightly. "Oh, sorry. You looked like Sarah. I was dreaming." Dreaming. The word hung in the stale air between us, heavy and charged. He'd pulled back, his head rising from my shoulder like a reluctant guest. The warmth that had seeped through my sweater was gone, replaced by a chill that had nothing to do with the bus's inadequate heating. My shoulder felt strangely hollow, an ache blooming where his weight had been. It was a physical manifestation of the unsettling jolt that had run through me. Sarah. He'd called me Sarah. I'd managed a week, it's okay. My voice sounded thin, reedy, a far cry from the confident tone I imagined Sarah would possess. I hadn't moved, my own body rigid, a statue carved from apprehension. My gaze was fixed on the smudged window, the blurry landscape outside a meaningless smear of darkness and fleeting lights. My brown hair, a fact I'd always considered unremarkable, suddenly felt like a glaring neon sign screaming my otherness. Sarah's hair, I knew, was a fiery red, a beacon that drew attention wherever she went. Mine was the color of damp earth, easily overlooked. He'd shifted in his seat, the cheap fabric of the bus seat groaning in protest. I could feel him observing me, though I dared not meet his gaze. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the rhythmic thrum of the engine and the occasional sigh of another sleeping passenger. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the worn upholstery, to become invisible. The weight of his mistaken identity pressed down on me, a tangible thing. It wasn't just a simple case of mistaken identity. It was a reflection of something deeper, something I couldn't quite articulate. He cleared his throat, a soft rasp that nonetheless made me jump. "Funny, the things dreams do," he offered, his voice now a little more steady, though still tinged with a lingering grogginess. He ran a hand through his hair, which was tousled from sleep. It was dark, too, a shade I couldn't quite discern in the dim light. She and we've been talking a lot lately. In my head, anyway. My breath hitched. She and who was she? Was it Sarah? My sister? The thought was a cold dread seeping into my bones. He was talking about Sarah. He knew Sarah. And he'd mistaken me for her. The knot of guilt and apprehension that had been tightening in my stomach since I'd boarded this bus twisted even tighter. I was on my way to see Sarah, a visit fraught with unspoken resentments and the fragile hope of reconciliation. And here, in the dead of night, a stranger on a bus had conflated me with her. I finally turned my head, my eyes sweeping over him cautiously. He was younger than I'd initially thought, perhaps in his early 20s, with a lean build and a face that, even in its sleep-rumpled state, held a certain earnestness. Not the kind of face that belonged to someone who would casually mistake a stranger for a friend, or worse, a lover. He looked lost, and that, somehow, made the situation even more unnerving. Are you going far? I managed, my voice barely a whisper, aiming for casual, but landing somewhere closer to desperate. He blinked, his startling blue eyes focusing on me again. End of the line, he said, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. You too? The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. End of the line. It was the same destination I was headed for, the same destination Sarah was at. The coincidence felt less like chance and more like a deliberate, disorienting twist of fate. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots, to find logic in this bizarre encounter. Had Sarah mentioned him to anyone? Was he a friend of hers? A colleague? Or something more? The thought sent a fresh wave of anxiety through me. Yes, I replied, my voice a little stronger this time, though still fragile. End of the line. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. Small world, he mused, his gaze drifting back to the window. The conversation seemed to have reached a natural impasse, leaving us suspended in a shared, unspoken awkwardness. He didn't press for details, and I certainly wasn't offering any. My internal monologue, however, was in overdrive. Who was this person? What was his connection to Sarah? And why, oh why, had he mistaken me for her? Was it the proximity? The dim light? Or was there something in my demeanor, some subtle echo of Sarah, that had triggered his dream? I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, trying to create a little more space between us, a physical buffer against the unsettling intimacy that had briefly and disturbingly existed. The warmth of his head on my shoulder had been a transgression of my personal space, and his subsequent mistaken identity had felt like an invasion of my very identity. It was as if he had taken a piece of me, my perceived resemblance to Sarah, and worn it like a borrowed coat. He pulled out a worn paperback from his jacket pocket, its cover creased and dog-eared. The title was obscured by the dim light, but the act of him settling back into his own private world felt like a relief. I, too, reached for my backpack, fumbling for the book I'd brought along, a collection of poetry I'd been meaning to revisit. But my hands trembled slightly, and the words on the page swam before my eyes. I couldn't concentrate. My focus kept drifting back to him, to the startling blue of his eyes, to the casual way he'd called